If you dare to uncover the horrors lurking just beneath the surface, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Because once you're here, there's no escape from the nightmares that await. Ready to face your fears? Let's begin. Ethan first noticed it on his way home from work. It was late, the streets were empty, and a thick fog had settled over the city. He was scrolling through his phone when a strange sensation made him glance up. Across the street, beneath the flickering glow of a dying street lamp, stood a figure. It was barely visible through the mist, but one detail stood out immediately: the grin. A wide, unnatural smile stretched across its face, unmoving, unblinking. Ethan felt his skin crawl. The figure didn't move, didn't shift, didn't react as he stared at it. Just smiled. He quickly turned away, shaking off the unease. Maybe it was a trick of the light, or some weirdo playing a prank. He picked up his pace and hurried home, shutting and locking his apartment door behind him. But the image of that eerie, motionless grin lingered in his mind. The next night, Ethan saw it again. This time, it was closer. It stood outside a convenience store as he walked past, its face partially obscured by the store's neon glow. Same grin, same stillness. Ethan's pulse quickened. He looked away, walked faster. His apartment was only 3 blocks away, but with every step, the sensation of being watched pressed heavier against his back. He forced himself not to turn around. He didn't want to know if it was following him. When he reached his building, he fumbled with his keys, hands shaking. He slammed the door behind him and leaned against it, listening. Nothing, no footsteps, no knocks. Maybe he was imagining things. The following night, Ethan was ready. He told himself that if he saw the thing again, he'd confront it. Ask what its deal was. Prove to himself that it was just some messed up joke. But when he saw it, all thoughts of confrontation vanished. It was standing in the alley beside his apartment, closer than ever before. The moment Ethan laid eyes on it, something in his body screamed run, but he couldn't. His legs felt locked in place as he took in its details for the first time. The grin wasn't just wide, it was too wide, stretching impossibly across its face. Its eyes, deep and black, glistened in the dim light, fixed directly on him. The longer he looked, the more he realized the grin wasn't painted on or exaggerated by shadows. It was real, a part of its face. And then it moved. Not a step, not a twitch, but an impossible glide, as if it wasn't bound by the rules of normal movement. 1 second it was in the alley, the next it was at the edge of the sidewalk. Ethan bolted. He didn't care how crazy he looked, sprinting full speed up the stairs to his apartment, slamming the door, locking it, barricading it with furniture. His breath came in short, panicked gasps. He refused to look out the peephole. He didn't sleep that night. For the next few days, Ethan didn't leave his apartment. He kept the blinds shut. He ignored his phone. He told himself that if he stayed inside long enough, the thing would go away. But he could still feel it. Watching. On the 4th night, his phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Why did you run?" Ethan's stomach dropped. His hands shook as he typed back. "Who is this?" 3 dots appeared, then another message. "You saw me. I saw you." Isn't that how it works? Ethan's breath hitched. He turned his phone off, tossed it across the room. His apartment felt too quiet, too still. He strained to hear past his own breathing. And then, a knock, a single light tap at his door. He froze. His mind screamed, "Don't answer it." But the silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. Slowly he stepped toward the peephole, hesitating before pressing his eye to the glass. At first, he saw nothing. Then, it appeared. Not standing, not knocking, but grinning, right against the peephole. Ethan stumbled back with a strangled gasp. His heart hammered as he backed away, but the knock came again. Tap, tap, tap. He didn't move, didn't breathe. Minutes passed, an eternity. Then, his phone buzzed again. One final message lit up the screen. Closer. Ethan never left his apartment again. Neighbors started whispering about the smell, about the flies gathering by his windows. Eventually, the landlord forced the door open. The apartment was empty, except for Ethan's phone, sitting in the middle of the floor, screen glowing with one final text message. Still watching. In the year 1963, a covert experiment was launched by a secret government agency disguised as a sleep study. Its true aim, however, was far darker than they let on. 5 volunteers were selected, prisoners, all of them. They were promised their freedom in exchange for their participation in a revolutionary sleep study. The experiment was simple. They would be kept awake for as long as possible, under constant observation, to study the effects of sleep deprivation. The researchers believed that pushing the limits of the human mind could unlock new dimensions of perception. The prisoners were isolated in a small, soundproof room with only a single observation window. Their food and water were carefully measured, and each subject was given a radio, which would broadcast calming sounds in an attempt to stave off the effects of sleep deprivation. At first, the prisoners handled the sleepless nights with little resistance. They would occasionally chatter about their lives before incarceration or complain about the oddity of the study. But they remained mostly calm. For the first 5 days, their behavior was routine, even if their eyes grew heavier and their movements slower. By day 6, the first signs of madness began to show. The prisoners began to argue. Paranoia set in as they realized no one else was allowed to leave the room. "They're watching us," one prisoner muttered, his voice growing frantic. "They're testing us. They want to see how far we'll go." The others stared at him, their eyes wide with both fear and curiosity. It wasn't long before the sounds they heard over the radio started to change. At first, it was subtle, a faint scratching noise in the background, like someone dragging their nails across the glass. The whispers began soon after, low, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to echo within the room. The prisoners, once strong, became increasingly fragile. Their once sturdy physical forms were now weak, twitching like marionettes. The researchers watched from the observation room, eager to study the psychological deterioration. They recorded every change in behavior, but something else was happening. A presence, something they couldn't understand, was starting to take form within the room. By day 10, one prisoner, Simon, had completely lost his grip on reality. His eyes were wide with terror, his skin pale, and his body unnaturally still. He no longer spoke. He simply stared at the corner of the room, trembling. "What's happening to him?" one of the researchers asked. "We have to stop this experiment," another whispered. But it was too late. On the 12th day, the whispers intensified, louder and more urgent. Then the shadows began to move. The prisoners, now reduced to shells of their former selves, could no longer distinguish between the real and the imagined. Simon suddenly screamed, pointing toward the corner where shadows twisted like smoke. "It's here! It's coming for us!" The others, too afraid to move, huddled together, staring at the shifting forms in the corner of the room. It wasn't just their minds playing tricks. They could see the shadows, feel them, as if they were alive, inching closer to their bodies. Then, at midnight on day 13, something snapped. The door to the observation room opened. One of the researchers, unable to cope with the horror unfolding, entered the chamber. He was found later, curled up in the corner, his eyes wide open, mouth agape, as though he had been screaming for hours. His body was contorted in unnatural ways, like a puppet torn from its strings. The prisoners were gone. When the remaining researchers entered the room, they found only bloodstains and shattered glass. No bodies. Nothing that remained could explain what had happened. The experiment was deemed a failure, but that wasn't the end of the story. A few weeks later, one of the lead researchers began to experience nightmares. He would wake in the middle of the night, gasping for breath, his skin slick with sweat. Every night, the same dream. A dark, shadowy figure looming over his bed, whispering his name. His nightmares grew more vivid, and soon he began hearing whispers even while awake. It became impossible to tell if they were real or imagined. The walls of his home seemed to close in on him, and shadows began to move in the corner of his eyes. Then, one night, as he sat in his office reviewing the experiment's notes, the door slammed shut behind him. The air grew heavy, and the whispers filled the room, louder now, as if they were standing right behind him. The last thing he saw was a figure, long and slender, emerging from the shadows. A shape that was not quite human. It smiled, its mouth stretching far too wide, and its eyes gleamed with a darkness that was never meant to be seen. The following morning, he was found dead, his eyes wide open, frozen in terror. There were no signs of a struggle, but his face had been contorted into a grin, twisted in a way that was not human. The sleep experiment, they said, had unlocked something it should not have, a force beyond human understanding. And as for the whispers, they still echo in the night. The shadows are watching, and the fear is real.